The archive smelled of old paper and quiet neglect, the kind of air that clung to your clothes and whispered of centuries gone by. Eleanor Grant had worked here for nearly 15 years, tucked away in a corner desk beneath the tallest shelves, cataloguing the forgotten relics of the county's medieval collection. Her work was not glamorous. She wasn't the sort of person who made headlines or drew gasps in lecture halls. She was quiet, methodical, and invisible to most of her colleagues. Except when someone needed a book they couldn't find, and Eleanor, without fail, knew exactly where it was. On a Thursday afternoon, while reshelving a stack of manuscripts, her gloved fingers brushed against a roll of parchment wedged between two crumbling ledgers. She pulled it free with care, feeling the faint grit of centuries-old dust against her fingertips. The parchment was unusually thick, with edges browned and curling. A faded leather strap bound it tight, and as she untied it, the faint smell of smoke and rain drifted up. When she spread it open on the wide oak table, Eleanor's breath caught. It was a map, hand-drawn in deep brown ink, its lines and curves marked with symbols she didn't immediately recognize. But what struck her most was how wrong it looked. She had memorized most of the region's medieval cartography over the years, and yet here were rivers that should not exist, mountains where flatland ought to be, and in the center, a crown-shaped emblem inked in gold leaf. She bent closer, tracing the delicate lines, noticing strange runic letters worked into the rivers. There were no identifying dates. But the style was distinctly pre-14th century. At the bottom, the map-maker's signature was missing, an anomaly that only deepened her curiosity. She leaned back, the dim library light catching the gold crown in such a way that it seemed to glimmer. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also a question without an answer. The sound of footsteps broke her trance. "Still here, Eleanor?" asked Martin Hayes, one of the senior historians, his voice clipped. "Careful with that old rubbish. You know how these medieval forgeries can be. Waste of time, really." He didn't even pause to look before walking on. Her cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. She waited until his footsteps faded before pulling the map fully into the light. Forgery or not, she couldn't let it go. Something about it tugged at her, an itch at the back of her mind. As if she had seen part of this design before, perhaps in another manuscript, another lifetime. That night, she stayed late. The rest of the staff left one by one, the echo of doors closing marking the building's retreat into silence. Alone, Eleanor lit a small desk lamp and angled it low over the parchment. She fetched a magnifying glass and began to study each line, each blot of ink. That was when she noticed it, barely visible in the dim light. A faint overlayer of ink in places where rivers met mountains. She tilted the parchment toward the glow, and there it was. Tiny, almost imperceptible hatch marks in red ink, forming patterns beneath the main drawing. She recognized the style immediately. Not many did, but she had once restored a medieval psalter from a remote abbey in Cornwall, and its illuminations had borne similar red ink markings used as navigation cues, not for ships, but for pilgrimages. The thought made her heart race. Pilgrimage routes led to holy places, or to places someone wanted hidden from all but the most determined. Her mind swirled with possibilities. Could this be pointing to a site lost to time? The crowned emblem suddenly felt heavier with meaning. And then a whisper of a memory. An offhand reference in a monk's journal she had read years ago. The crowned hills where no king had ever sat. She hadn't understood it then. Now it clawed its way back to her with urgency. Eleanor knew this was no ordinary map, and if her instincts were right, she was holding a piece of history that had been deliberately erased. She didn't yet know why or by whom, but she knew this. The map's secrets would not give themselves up easily. As she carefully rolled the parchment back up and locked it in her desk drawer, her pulse was still quick. She told herself it was just professional interest, nothing more. But deep down she knew she had already crossed a threshold, one from which she would not turn back. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Martin Hayes's life. The rain outside hammered the library's tall windows like impatient fingers, but Eleanor barely noticed. She had locked the door to the tiny staff room behind her and unrolled the map once more on the round oak table. A single beeswax candle flickered beside her, its light softer and more revealing than the harsh electric lamps. It was here, in this half-shadow, that the truth began to show itself. She leaned close, eyes scanning the parchment. The red hatch marks she had seen the night before danced faintly beneath the main lines, almost as if the map-maker had hidden them deliberately. Marks meant to be visible only under a certain kind of light. She adjusted the candle so its flame passed just above the parchment surface. That was when she saw it. A faint shimmer, like water catching moonlight, spread across the bottom right corner. Slowly, as if coaxing a shy creature into the open, the shimmer formed shapes, tiny painted symbols no larger than a fingernail. They depicted a winding path leading to a shape that looked unmistakably like a crown made of 3 peaks. Her breath caught. She had seen that crown before, in a marginal illustration of a codex written by Brother Anselm, a 13th century monk who was rumoured to have chronicled lands outside the known kingdoms. In the codex, Anselm called it Regnum Obscurum, the Dark Kingdom. Most historians dismissed it as a fanciful invention, a medieval fairy tale. But here it was again, on a map. Her heart pounded with the force of discovery and dread all at once. If she was right, then this wasn't just a lost village or an abandoned monastery. This was an entire realm that had vanished from record, and someone had taken great pains to ensure it stayed that way. She grabbed her leather-bound notebook and began sketching the symbols, copying every curve, every angle. She noted the strange, deliberate distortion of distances on the map, something cartographers did when they didn't want outsiders to find the true location without knowing the cipher. As the night deepened, Eleanor's excitement began to dull under the weight of another thought. She was in dangerous territory. Not the kind where swords clashed, but the kind where reputations were destroyed. To present something like this without ironclad proof was to invite ridicule. She had seen it happen to others, a promising young researcher reduced to whispers and side glances after presenting an unverified theory. She shook her head. This was different. This was solid. This was... Her conviction faltered at the sound of a sudden knock on the door. She jumped, hastily rolling the map and shoving it under a pile of old atlases. "Yes?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened a crack, revealing the sharp profile of Martin Hayes. "Still chasing ghosts?" His eyes darted to the table, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. Eleanor forced a smile. "Just sorting some late donations." He hesitated, then let the door fall shut. His footsteps faded down the corridor. Only when she was sure he was gone did she let out the breath she'd been holding. She didn't like the way he had looked at her, like he suspected something worth prying into. She decided then that she could no longer work on the map in the library. She carefully slid the parchment into a protective case, wrapped it in plain brown paper, and tucked it inside her satchel. As she fastened the clasp, she caught her own reflection in the darkened window. Her eyes were brighter than they had been in years, and though her mouth was a tight line, she could feel the smallest hint of a smile. The archivist in her knew this was a professional risk. The human in her knew it was worth everything. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take the map somewhere safer. Somewhere she could work without the cold breath of skepticism on her neck. And perhaps, just perhaps, she might find someone who still believed in impossible places. Eleanor had always been cautious about who she spoke to in the academic world. She'd seen how quickly a whispered doubt could snowball into professional ruin. So when she arrived at the university's medieval studies department the next morning, clutching her satchel tightly to her side, she already knew her approach would be careful, measured, until the moment she saw Professor Edmund Vail. Vail was a man whose reputation filled entire lecture halls. His papers on medieval iconography were cited in textbooks, his voice invited to documentaries, his name spoken with reverence. But to Eleanor, he was also the embodiment of intellectual arrogance, a man who smiled when agreeing with you and smirked when he didn't. He was standing at the faculty lounge counter, pouring himself a coffee, when she stepped inside. "Professor Vail," she began, keeping her tone polite, "I've come across something unusual in the archives. A map, possibly late 13th century, with markings I think you'd find." He cut her off with a raised eyebrow. "Another map? Eleanor, I trust you've verified its authenticity?" "The last thing we need is another intern with a lost treasure fantasy." "I'm not an intern," she said, forcing calm. "And I think this might relate to Brother Anselm's work on the Regnum Obscurum." That got his attention, but not in the way she hoped. He chuckled, actually chuckled, shaking his head. "The Dark Kingdom? Eleanor, that's medieval mythology. A fairy tale scribbled by a monk with too much time and too little wine. Entire conferences have debunked it." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel. "I'm aware of the debates, but this map has—" "I'm sure it's fascinating," he interrupted again, his tone all sugar and dismissal. "But we deal in history here, not bedtime stories. My advice? File it under curiosities and move on." The heat in her chest was sharp and humiliating. She felt the weight of his words, the finality in them, as though he had closed a door in her face without even looking through it. Around them, the lounge had gone quiet. A pair of graduate students nearby pretended to type on their laptops, but their ears were angled toward the exchange. She swallowed the lump in her throat, nodded curtly, and turned to leave. "Thank you for your time, Professor." Outside in the hall, her steps were brisk, the echo of her shoes against the tile, a drumbeat of anger. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the ease with which he had done it. He hadn't even asked to see the map. She reached the building's front steps and paused, the cool morning air brushing her face. She could go back to the library, lock the map away, and let it gather dust until someone braver came along. But the thought of Martin Hayes's smirk, of Vail's patronizing smile, stiffened her spine. She turned right instead of left, heading toward the small bookshop on Whitaker Street. Inside, tucked behind rows of history volumes, was the notice board where independent scholars and hobbyists posted meeting announcements. Her eyes scanned the jumble of flyers until one caught her attention. Local History Society, monthly gathering, guest speaker, Thomas Kendrick, retired royal cartographer. She didn't know Kendrick personally, but his name had floated around in her circles, a man whose field experience rivaled any academics, but without the politics. If anyone could see the map for what it was, it might be him. Eleanor pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the flyer. She checked the date. The meeting was tonight. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear this time, but from the thrill of possibility. The archivist in her knew she had just been dismissed by one of the highest authorities in her field. The human in her knew that only made the chase more worthwhile. Somewhere deep inside, beneath years of quiet compliance, a defiant voice whispered, "Let's see who's telling the bedtime stories now." The meeting hall was nothing grand, just a modest room above a bakery, the scent of fresh bread and sugar drifting up the narrow staircase. Eleanor hesitated at the door, clutching her satchel. She could hear the low murmur of voices inside, the occasional laugh, the sound of chairs scraping against the old wooden floor. When she stepped in, a dozen faces turned toward her, most of them lined with age and curiosity. They were hobbyists and retirees, not professors or curators, people who explored dusty attics, read obscure local histories, and spent their weekends chasing rumors of hidden ruins. It was disarming how welcoming their eyes felt compared to the cold scrutiny of academia. Near the front, a tall man with white hair stood by a projector, fiddling with the cables. His tweed jacket was worn at the elbows, and his hands bore the faint ink stains of a man who still drew maps by hand. This was Thomas Kendrick. She waited until he finished his brief talk on coastal erosion and the shifting boundaries of medieval trade routes before approaching him. "Mr. Kendrick," she began softly, "I believe I have something you'll want to see." He looked up from packing away his notes, his pale blue eyes sharp and assessing. "Do you now? Well, I'm always game for a curiosity." They moved to a quiet corner, away from the hum of conversation. Eleanor opened her satchel with deliberate care, sliding the wrapped bundle onto the table. She untied the string and unfolded the parchment, the candlelight from the hall's wall sconces glinting faintly off the gold crown. Kendrick's posture shifted immediately. He leaned in, his fingers hovering just above the surface, careful not to touch. "This is no reproduction," he murmured. "Parchments genuine. Ink work, layered, which means alterations. And these marks." He squinted at the faint red hatching beneath the rivers. "They're not for navigation by sea. These are land guides. Pilgrimage routes, maybe. Or something meant to stay hidden." Eleanor finished. He glanced at her sharply. "You've seen them before?" In a psalter attributed to Brother Anselm, he drew the same crown of 3 peaks. Most believe it's fiction, but... She gestured to the map. Kendrick's mouth tightened in thought. "If this is tied to Anselm's Regnum Obscurum, you're sitting on one of the rarest medieval artifacts in Britain. And if the cipher can be broken..." He trailed off, his gaze lifting to hers. "Where did you get this?" "From the county archives, forgotten between 2 ledgers." His expression darkened slightly. "Does anyone else know you have it?" "A historian at the library saw me with it, Martin Hayes. I don't think he recognized its value, but I can't be certain." Kendrick folded the parchment carefully, as if it were his own heartbeat he was handling. "You need to keep this out of official hands until you've confirmed its authenticity and origin. If this falls into the wrong circles, it'll vanish into a private collection before the public ever knows it exists." Eleanor nodded. "Can you help me read it?" A slow smile tugged at his mouth. "It's been years since anyone's brought me a real challenge." He tapped the edge of the parchment. "We'll start tomorrow morning. I know a place where we can work undisturbed." As she repacked the map, Eleanor felt a cautious surge of relief. She had found her ally, not in the hallowed halls of academia, but in a warm, dimly lit room above a bakery, among people who believed that history's greatest treasures sometimes lay in the hands of the overlooked. Outside, the night was damp and quiet. She stepped into the dark street. the scent of bread still in her lungs, and for the first time since unrolling that map, she felt less alone. The morning broke grey and misty, the kind of weather that blurred the horizon and made the world feel smaller, more secretive. Eleanor arrived at the address Kendrick had sent her, a converted mill on the edge of town, its stone walls streaked with moss and ivy. A narrow canal ran alongside it, the water dark and still. Inside, the mill had been transformed into a workshop of maps. Old maritime charts curled in brass frames, medieval town plans were tacked to corkboards, and stacks of rolled parchment lined the shelves like soldiers at attention. The air smelled of vellum, cedar, and a faint trace of pipe tobacco. Kendrick was already there, setting out tools on a wide drafting table, magnifying glasses, ultraviolet lamps, brushes, and a collection of reference books thick enough to double as doorstops. He gestured for her to place the map in the center. "Now," he said, flicking on the UV lamp, "let's see what our ghost map has been hiding." Under the violet glow, the surface came alive with secrets. Thin lines, invisible under normal light, radiated from the crown emblem like spokes of a wheel. Along these lines were clusters of dots, some larger, some barely specks. "They're waypoints," Kendrick muttered, tracing the sequence with a gloved finger. "And these clusters, they're not towns, too irregular. Could be markers for natural formations." Eleanor leaned closer. "Or traps?" He gave her a sharp look, then a wry grin. "You've read too many adventure novels." But a moment later, his grin faded. "Still, you might not be wrong. Map makers protecting a sacred or political secret would often build in misleading routes for the uninitiated." For hours they worked in silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning and pencils scratching. The cipher began to yield under their combined attention. Distances on the map weren't literal. They were coded through a medieval system of musical intervals, a method used by certain monastic orders to obscure the locations of valuable relics. It was Kendrick who first pieced the sequence together. 3 days' journey from the abbey ruins at Brynmore, he said, tapping the final notation. That would put it. He reached for another map, layered the two together, and pointed to a green smudge of hills on the western fringe of the county. "Right here." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. She knew those hills. Remote, overgrown, and largely avoided by hikers because of the steep, crumbling paths. Locals called them the Crowned Hills. Kendrick leaned back, his eyes alight. "If the map's right, there's something buried in or beneath them, and we'll need to see it for ourselves." She hesitated. "You mean—" "Go there. What about permissions, surveys, documentation?" He waved a hand. "If we wait for red tape, we'll be dead before we see what's there. We'll go quietly. Just us." The thought sent a flicker of unease through her. The rules she had lived by, preserve, document, protect, warred with a growing sense of urgency. Martin Hayes's face drifted through her mind, and she wondered how long it would take him to start asking questions. "All right," she said finally. "When?" Kendrick checked his watch. "Tomorrow morning. Light travel. Bring boots you don't mind ruining." As she left the mill, the mist had thickened, swallowing the path ahead. For the first time in years, Eleanor didn't mind not seeing what was coming. Somewhere in those hills lay the answer, and perhaps the reckoning, she had been chasing since the moment she unrolled that map. The journey began under a sky the color of wet slate. Eleanor and Kendrick left before dawn, their boots crunching over frost-hardened grass as they followed a narrow path leading out of town. The hills rose ahead of them like sleeping giants, their slopes draped in ivy and bramble. They carried only what was necessary: water, a few tools, and the map rolled tight inside a waterproof case strapped to Eleanor's pack. The rest, Kendrick insisted, would be improvised. "If you plan too much," he said, navigating a fallen log, "you leave no room for discovery." The climb was steep and relentless. Roots coiled like snakes across the path, and loose stones threatened to turn every step into a fall. As they pushed deeper into the hills, the air seemed to change, cooler, denser, as if the world here had been preserved in a slower time. By midday, they reached a ridge that overlooked a shallow valley. Below them, half hidden beneath decades of overgrowth, was a stone wall. It was not tall, barely 3 feet in some places, but the regularity of the cut stone was undeniable. Kendrick crouched, studying the pattern. "Defensive outer wall," he murmured. "Medieval construction, no question. And look there." He pointed to a section where the ivy hung heavier than the rest. "That's not just overgrowth. That's covering something." They descended into the valley, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. Kendrick's gloved hands pulled at the curtain of ivy, revealing a carved archway, its keystone marked with the crown of 3 peaks. Eleanor's breath caught. "It's the same as on the map." She traced the carving with her fingers, feeling the grooves worn smooth by centuries. Beneath the archway, a dark passage yawned, the air that seeped from it cool and stale. "This isn't just an entrance," Kendrick said quietly. "It's an invitation." They stepped inside, their headlamps slicing through the darkness. The stone walls were damp, beaded with condensation. Faded frescoes clung to the surface, scenes of crowned figures and processions, the pigments still stubbornly clinging after all these years. Then came the inscriptions, lines of angular script neither had seen before. Kendrick knelt, brushing away debris. "This isn't Latin," he said. "Could be an older Celtic tongue, maybe a hybrid." Eleanor crouched beside him, her fingers brushing one particular symbol, a crown resting above an open hand. Something about it felt heavy. "What do you think it means?" Kendrick's expression was unreadable. "It means we're not the first to come here." She followed his gaze to the floor, where faint boot prints marked the damp dust, too fresh to be centuries old. A cold thread of dread wound itself through Eleanor's spine. Whoever else had found this place, they might still be nearby. Kendrick rose, his voice low. "We keep going, quietly." The passage sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step, until the sound of dripping water echoed faintly ahead. Somewhere in the dark, the heart of the forgotten kingdom waited, along with whatever secrets or dangers had kept it hidden for so long. The tunnel opened into a cavern so vast that Eleanor's headlamp beam seemed to dissolve before it could touch the far wall. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of minerals and age. Stalactites hung like the teeth of some enormous creature. But it wasn't the natural formations that made Eleanor's heart stop. It was the city. There, beneath the earth, lay streets paved in pale stone, buildings carved directly into the rock face, and archways adorned with crowns and unfamiliar symbols. An underground river ran along the city's edge, reflecting their lights in trembling ribbons. It was as if time had folded in on itself, preserving this place in perfect stillness. Kendrick let out a low whistle. "Regnum obscurum," he whispered, as though saying the name aloud might awaken it. They stepped cautiously down a worn set of stairs, their footsteps echoing. Each building they passed told a fragment of a story: a market stall with stone counters, a public square with a fountain still holding stagnant water, a grand hall with its roof partially collapsed, but its columns still standing proud. Eleanor's eyes caught on a wall of intricate carvings. Unlike the decorative crowns they had seen before, these depicted scenes: a ruler seated beneath the three peaks, a crowd offering gifts, soldiers marching toward an unseen foe. In the final panel, the city gates were sealed shut from the inside. "It wasn't abandoned," Eleanor murmured, tracing the carved lines. "It was hidden." Kendrick joined her, running his fingers over the final scene. To protect something, or someone. They moved deeper into the city until they reached what appeared to be a central chamber. Here, the crowns were everywhere, painted on walls, carved into the floor, inlaid with what looked like tarnished silver. In the center stood a raised stone platform. Resting upon it was a chest, its iron bindings mottled with rust, but still intact. Eleanor approached slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knelt, examining the lock. It was an intricate mechanism of interlocking plates and pins, unlike any medieval lock she had seen before. "This would take hours to force," she said, glancing at Kendrick. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze had drifted toward the shadows beyond the chamber. Eleanor followed it, and froze. A figure stood there, partially obscured by the darkness. Tall, broad-shouldered, and holding a flashlight that caught the glint of metal in their other hand. The voice that came was low and steady. "You've found something that doesn't belong to you." Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. She glanced at Kendrick, whose jaw had tightened. Whoever this was, they had been here before, and they weren't surprised to see intruders. The figure stepped forward, the beam of their flashlight sweeping across the chest, the crowns, and finally settling on Eleanor's face. "You'll leave the map," the stranger said, "and you'll forget you ever came here." For the first time, Eleanor understood the full weight of what they had uncovered. Not just a kingdom, but a secret worth guarding at any cost. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The cavern seemed to press in on them. The drip of water somewhere in the darkness, like the tick of an impatient clock. Eleanor's mind raced, not with fear alone, but with the sharp clarity that came when instinct demanded a choice. She straightened slowly, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This kingdom was never yours to claim," she said. "It was meant to be remembered, not buried in silence." The stranger's grip on the flashlight tightened. The glint of metal in their other hand resolved into a pry bar, not a weapon, though its intent was clear. "History belongs to those who can keep it," they replied, stepping closer. Kendrick moved to stand between them and Eleanor. "You've had your chance to do right by this place," he said, "and you chose to hide it. We won't." The figure's gaze flickered between them, calculating. For a tense moment, Eleanor thought they might lunge, but then, with a sharp exhale, the stranger lowered the flashlight and stepped back into the shadows. "Leave," they said flatly, "and pray no one less patient finds you here." They were gone before Eleanor could form a reply, their footsteps swallowed by the labyrinth of streets. Kendrick's voice was low. "We don't have much time." He turned to the chest, producing a small roll of tools from his pack. The lock yielded after several tense minutes, the pins clicking in a sequence that sounded almost like a sigh. Inside, beneath a layer of fine dust, lay objects that stole Eleanor's breath. A crown of beaten gold, its three peaks still gleaming faintly. scrolls wrapped in silk, their seals unbroken, and a carved stone tablet inscribed with the same symbol of a crown above an open hand. Eleanor touched the tablet, feeling the weight of it in her palms. This is the kingdom's story. They worked quickly, photographing everything, taking careful notes. Nothing left the chamber except their records. Kendrick insisted the artifacts remain undisturbed. If we take them, they disappear into the same shadow as before, he said. But if we reveal them properly... By the time they emerged from the hills, dusk had settled, painting the sky in muted gold and violet. The air outside felt sharper, cleaner, as though the earth itself had exhaled. Weeks later, Eleanor stood in the county archive's main reading room, a display case before her. Inside was a high-resolution reproduction of the map, alongside photographs of the crowned hills carvings. The exhibition placard bore her name, not as a footnote, but as lead researcher. Martin Hayes passed by without a word, his expression unreadable. Eleanor didn't need his approval anymore. She had learned the truth, that history's treasures were not always claimed by those with the loudest voices, but often by those patient enough to listen to the whispers in the dust. The headlines called it the discovery of the forgotten kingdom. For Eleanor, it was something quieter, more personal, a vindication not just of her skill, but of the belief that the overlooked could still change the story. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.